air was thick with tension as the party unfolded. It was a typical teenage get-together, music blasting, bodies moving in rhythm with reckless abandon. But something dark lingered beneath the surface. Jake was the center of attention as always, but his eyes kept darting to the door. A sense of unease spread like a slow poison, unnoticed by most. Sarah, standing by the window, watched as the room pulsed with energy, a feeling of foreboding slowly creeping in. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "He's here." Her breath caught in her throat, heart hammering as she glanced over at Jake, who had his back to her. Was he involved in something sinister? She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would end in disaster. No one knew yet, but someone was about to cross a line they couldn't come back from. The music hit a crescendo, loud enough to drown out any thought. But then, like a thunderclap, everything went still. The door creaked open. Everyone turned. Standing there was someone Sarah didn't recognize, tall, with an unsettling calm. Jake stiffened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Why is he here? Sarah's mind raced. It didn't make sense. This was supposed to be just a party. Just some loud music, bad decisions, and forgotten moments. But this was something else entirely. Jake's expression darkened, and he stepped forward. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the underlying fear. The newcomer didn't answer. He just smiled, a smile that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Just passing through," he said softly, his words sharp like a blade. It was clear, though, this wasn't a visit. It was a warning. The figure moved further into the room, his presence causing an uneasy ripple among the guests. No one dared approach him. Sarah's stomach twisted as she watched the stranger's eyes fall to Jake. The tension between them was palpable, and Jake's hands had begun to tremble. Who is he? Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of something bigger, something darker. Jake's expression darkened, and he stepped forward. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice was low, strained. The stranger didn't answer, his smile never wavering. He only nodded at Jake. "I'm just here to remind you of what you've done," the stranger said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The party slowly began to resume, but it was different now. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. The newcomer's presence had cast a long shadow. Sarah stood near the corner, her back against the cold wall, watching as Jake spoke in low tones with the figure. She couldn't hear their words, but the body language was enough. Jake was tense, his hands moving restlessly as the figure remained calm, almost unnervingly so. Then, just as quickly as he arrived, the stranger began to leave, slipping out the back door without a word. But Jake wasn't looking at him anymore. He was staring directly at Sarah, his gaze dark and filled with something unreadable. The room felt smaller as Sarah's pulse quickened. "I need to talk to you," Jake said, his voice lower than before. It wasn't a request. She nodded, fear slowly creeping up her spine. Something had happened. Something that would change everything. Sarah followed Jake into the quiet, dimly lit kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound filling the void. "What's going on, Jake?" she asked, her voice shaky. He turned to face her, and for the first time that night, she saw something she hadn't expected: guilt. "You don't understand. It's not what you think," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Then what is it?" Jake exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "I got involved with the wrong people, okay? It wasn't supposed to go this far." The truth hung between them like a guillotine waiting to fall. Sarah was no fool. She could see the cracks in his story, and she wasn't about to let him off the hook. "What are you not telling me, Jake?" she demanded. But before he could respond, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. Far too far away to help. The sirens grew louder as Sarah stared at Jake, her mind racing. What was going on? Why hadn't he told her the truth before? Why was everything spiraling so quickly? "I didn't want this," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper, his hands shaking. But I got involved, and now it's too late. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, unable to focus on anything for long. The sound of sirens now unmistakable. Too late for what, Jake? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. Jake shook his head, frustration etched across his face. The people I got involved with, they're dangerous. If I don't do what they say. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah's heart pounded. She didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. This wasn't just a party gone wrong. This was much bigger. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The weight of Jake's words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating her thoughts. So, what are we supposed to do now? She asked, barely able to hear her own voice over the growing wail of sirens. Jake stepped back, his hands still shaking. I don't know, but we need to get out of here. He turned toward the door, glancing over his shoulder at her. They're coming. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. She wanted to protest, to demand more answers, but the fear in Jake's eyes told her everything. He wasn't lying, he was terrified. Without another word, she followed him through the kitchen, toward the back door, the sound of sirens echoing louder in her ears. They stepped into the alley behind the house, the cool night air biting at their skin. Sarah looked around, her mind spinning. Who are these people, Jake? She demanded, her voice stronger now, desperation giving way to anger. Jake's eyes flickered, guilt clouding his features. I told you, I didn't mean for this to happen. He paused, swallowing hard. They're dangerous people, and they know I messed up. If we don't get out of here, we're both in trouble. Sarah's heart pounded. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. They were running from something. Or someone. A soft sound in the distance interrupted their conversation. A car. The headlights swept down the alley. They're here, Jake whispered, his voice tight. The car came to a screeching halt in front of them. The headlights illuminated the alley, blinding Sarah for a moment. Jake pushed her behind him, shielding her as much as he could. A figure stepped out of the car, tall and imposing, dressed in black. The man's face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his presence was enough to send a chill through Sarah's veins. I don't want trouble, Jake said, his voice shaking. We'll go with you. Just let us go. The figure didn't respond at first, just taking slow, deliberate steps toward them. You don't get to decide that, he said in a low voice. His gaze locked onto Sarah. She's the one we're interested in. Sarah's blood ran cold at the figure's words. Me? She asked, her voice barely audible. The man nodded, his face still hidden in shadow. You're the key, he said cryptically. Sarah's mind raced. She wasn't part of this. She couldn't be. Her hands began to tremble as she took a small step back. I don't know anything, she whispered, almost pleading. But the figure wasn't listening. He stepped closer, and Sarah instinctively moved closer to Jake. I told you, Jake muttered, his eyes wide with fear. I never wanted this. The man reached into his coat, pulling out something small and metallic. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized it was a gun. This doesn't have to end badly, the man said, his tone almost kind. But you're going to have to come with me. The air was thick with the tension of impending violence. The figure with the gun took a slow step towards Sarah, his movements deliberate. Jake stepped forward, his body a shield between Sarah and the man. You don't have to do this, Jake said, his voice cracking. Just take me, let her go. The figure paused, looking at Jake with cold indifference. She's the one we want, not you, he replied, his tone devoid of any emotion. Sarah could feel her heart hammering in her chest. She had no idea who these people were, why they wanted her, or what they wanted her for. She could feel Jake's hand on her arm, pulling her back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the end. Nothing would be the same after tonight. The figure's eyes flicked to Sarah, his gaze calculating. I'm not here for him, he said. I'm here for you. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. What do you want from me? The figure's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "That's not for you to know," he said, his voice low and menacing. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, thick and suffocating. Jake's eyes never left the man, and Sarah could see the fear etched in his face. "Whatever it is, it's not worth it," Jake said, his voice full of urgency. "Please, just let us go." But the figure only shook his head. "It's already too late." Without warning, the man gestured with his gun toward the car. "Get in," he ordered. "Now." "Now?" Sarah hesitated, looking over at Jake. His face was pale, sweat dotting his forehead. "Jake, what's going on? Who are they?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and confusion. Jake met her gaze for a moment, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but we don't have a choice." Slowly, Sarah started to move toward the car, her feet feeling like lead. The figure's gaze followed her every step. "Move faster," he commanded. Sarah glanced back at Jake, fear and helplessness in her eyes. The man didn't need to say anything else. They both knew there was no escape. They reached the car, and the figure opened the door for Sarah with a fluid motion. As she slid into the back seat, the cold metal of the car's interior seemed to press down on her. Jake followed, sitting next to her, the door slamming shut behind him. The figure got into the front seat, his eyes still locked on them through the rearview mirror. "We're not going to hurt you," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. "But you need to understand something. Your involvement in this isn't optional." Sarah's mind was racing. "Involvement in what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer right away, instead focusing on the road ahead. The car started moving, the tires scraping against the gravel. As the car drove deeper into the night, Sarah's thoughts spiraled out of control. What was happening? Who were these people? Jake's hand gripped hers, offering a faint sense of comfort, but even that didn't feel like enough. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the indicator. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with dread. The figure in the front seat glanced at her in the rearview mirror again. "Somewhere safe," he said, his voice smooth like it was a promise. But Sarah could hear the hidden threat in his words. "Safe from what?" she asked, her voice shaking. But the figure didn't answer. The car finally came to a stop, the engine rumbling before it was silenced. Sarah looked out the window, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the empty road. The figure didn't speak as he got out, his movements deliberate and controlled. Jake's grip on Sarah's hand tightened, his breathing shallow. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's safe," Jake replied, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Sarah felt the weight of the moment press down on her chest. She had no idea where they were, or what would happen next. The gear opened the door for Sarah, and gestured for her to exit. "Come on," he said, his voice sharp. They stepped out of the car, and the cold night air hit Sarah's skin like a slap. She shivered involuntarily, her nerves already on edge. The figure led them toward a nondescript building, its windows dark. There were no sounds of life, only the distant hum of traffic somewhere far away. "This way," the figure muttered, motioning for them to follow. As they approached the building, Sarah felt a sense of foreboding settle in her stomach. Jake stayed close, his body tense. The figure reached for a set of keys and unlocked the door with a single swift motion. "We'll wait inside," he said, pushing the door open. The air inside was stale, the silence heavy. Inside, the building was even colder. The walls were bare, the floors cracked and worn. There was nothing comforting about the place. Sarah glanced around, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure turned, his cold eyes locking onto hers. "Sit down," he commanded. Sarah hesitated, but sat down on one of the chairs nearby. Jake followed her, sitting beside her, his hands still holding hers. The gear paced in front of them, his eyes scanning the room. "You're not here by accident," he said, his voice low. "You've been chosen. There's no going back now." Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of it all. Chosen for what? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure's lips curled into a cruel smile. The figure's smile faded as he stepped closer to them. You'll find out soon enough, he said cryptically. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything. The figure pulled something from his coat, a small, unmarked envelope, and placed it on the table in front of Sarah. Take it, he said. Sarah stared at the envelope for a moment before reaching out to grab it. Her fingers brushed against the paper, cold and smooth. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, its contents obscured by the dim light. She hesitated before unfolding it. The figure watched her with cold, unblinking eyes. Sarah unfolded the paper slowly, her heart racing as she read the words written in stark black ink. The message was simple, but its implications were terrifying. You have no choice. Her hands shook as she passed the paper to Jake. He read it quickly, his face growing even paler. What does this mean? Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Jake didn't answer at first, his gaze fixed on the paper. He handed it back to her, his voice barely audible. I don't know. The figure's gaze never wavered, and Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. This was more than just a warning. It was a promise. There's no way out, the figure said softly. Not for either of you. The figure's words echoed in Sarah's mind like a relentless drumbeat. There's no way out. She felt the room closing in on her, the walls pressing in from all sides. Jake's hand was still tightly clutching hers, but it didn't provide the comfort it had earlier. Now it only reminded her of the situation they were trapped in. What do you want from us? She demanded, her voice shaking, but her words coming out stronger than she expected. The figure didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, cold, almost calculating. You'll find out soon enough, he replied cryptically, his voice devoid of emotion. Sarah could feel her pulse in her throat, her mind racing with possibilities. Nothing made sense. Why were they involved in this? What was this about? The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah could hear the ticking of a distant clock, the soft hum of the air conditioner, and the sound of her own breath. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice hoarse. We don't know anything, we're just... He stopped, his words trailing off when the figure raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. The figure moved toward them, his steps slow and deliberate, and his voice cut through the air like a knife. You don't need to know anything yet. You just need to do exactly what I say. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but she quickly shut it. She realized she had no power here. They were pawns in a game, and the rules weren't up to them. The figure's presence filled the room, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random encounter. This was planned, orchestrated. What's the plan? Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The figure smirked, his eyes flicking to the envelope that Sarah had just read. The plan? He echoed. You're part of it, whether you like it or not. His words were cold, emotionless. You're here because someone needs you, and you're going to deliver. It's that simple. Sarah's mind swirled with confusion. She had no idea what he was talking about. Deliver what? She asked. The figure's smile widened, but there was nothing comforting about it. Your role will become clear soon. You'll do exactly what we need, and everything will go smoothly. A new wave of dread washed over Sarah. She could feel the weight of the situation sinking in. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to end well. The figure stood still for a moment, his eyes never leaving Sarah. You'll have help, he said, his voice low. But you'll have to trust us. Trust what we say. Sarah wanted to scream, to argue, but something inside her knew it wouldn't make a difference. She could feel Jake's hand trembling in hers, and she squeezed it harder, silently conveying that they were in this together. The figure turned away, walking toward a door at the back of the room. You'll meet the others soon. For now, stay here. Don't make a sound. With that, he stepped through the door, leaving them alone in the eerie quiet. Sarah and Jake sat in the stillness, the minutes stretching out like hours. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of the situation. Who were these people? What was their role in all of this? And why had they been chosen? "Jake, what do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice almost a whisper. Jake didn't answer immediately. He sat with his head lowered, hands clasped tightly together. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "But we have to find a way out of here. Whatever's coming, I don't think we can fight it." Sarah nodded silently, her thoughts spinning. They were trapped, caught in something far beyond their understanding. And as the minutes passed, she could only wonder what horrors lay ahead. The door creaked open, and the figure returned. He wasn't alone. Behind him, two more figures emerged, their faces obscured by dark hoods. Sarah tensed, her heart racing as they stepped into the room, their heavy footsteps echoing. One of the newcomers walked past them without a word, and the other stopped near the door, scanning the room like a predator. The figure who had brought them here stood by the wall, watching. "Meet the others," he said flatly. The tension in the air thickened, as Sarah's mind tried to process the new arrivals. Were they part of this group? Were they the ones who had been behind everything? "What do you want from us?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaky but laced with determination. The first newcomer spoke. "To make sure you understand your place." The figure in the front turned to face Sarah and Jake, his expression still cold and impassive. "You're part of something bigger now," he said, his words carrying a finality that made Sarah's stomach drop. "You've been chosen for a reason, but what happens next depends on how you follow the orders." The newcomer beside him stepped forward, closer to Jake, his movements deliberate. "You'll be tested," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You'll do what we say, or you'll never leave here." Sarah clenched her fists in her lap, trying to control the panic rising in her chest. She glanced at Jake, his eyes wide with fear. "We can't let them control us," she whispered. Jake nodded, but the uncertainty in his eyes told a different story. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel the weight of their words pressing down on her. The figure spoke again, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We don't have time for your questions. What matters is what you're willing to do." The figure turned to the door, motioning for them to follow. Sarah and Jake exchanged a look, both of them frozen in place. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. The figure didn't turn around. "You'll see." With that he opened the door, gesturing for them to step into the hallway. Sarah stood, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't know what awaited them, but the fear gnawing at her was almost unbearable. They walked down the dimly lit hallway, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick silence that surrounded them. Each step felt like an eternity, and Sarah could feel the air grow heavier the further they went. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The figure in front of them didn't answer right away. "You'll see when you get there," he said coldly, his voice echoing off the walls. Sarah and Jake exchanged uneasy glances. The building seemed endless, each corner more foreboding than the last. Finally, they reached a steel door at the end of the hallway. The figure stopped in front of it, turning to face them. "This is where you'll be tested," he said, his tone final. The figure opened the steel door, revealing a dark room beyond. "In there," he commanded. Sarah stepped forward, her heart racing, but Jake hesitated, looking back at the figure. "What happens inside?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure's response was simple. "Survive." Sarah's pulse quickened as she stepped into the room, her body tense, every sense on alert. The door slammed shut behind them with a loud final thud. The room was cold and barren, with nothing but darkness ahead. She could barely make out the shapes of what appeared to be metal barriers, like obstacles or walls, scattered throughout the space. She didn't know what she was about to face, but she knew that whatever it was, they had no choice but to face it. The door shut behind them with a resounding thud, sealing Sarah and Jake in the darkness of the room. The coldness of the air seemed to press in from all sides, and Sarah could feel the chill settle in her bones. "What are we supposed to do here?" she whispered, her voice shaky with the weight of the unknown. Jake remained silent beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly. The room was still, the silence oppressive. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, followed by the sound of metal sliding against metal. "We need to move," Jake muttered, his voice barely audible. Without another word, they began to walk cautiously through the room, every step taken with uncertainty. "Whatever happens, we stick together," Sarah said, trying to steady herself. The low hum continued, growing louder as they moved deeper into the room. It felt like something was watching them, the air heavy with tension. Suddenly the darkness parted, revealing faint red lights on the walls, casting eerie glows around them. The room was larger than they had initially thought. Metal barriers lined the edges, and at the far end there was a faint shadow of movement. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, as her eyes locked onto the movement. Jake's grip on her hand tightened. "I don't know, but we need to be ready," he said. The sound of shifting metal filled the space again, followed by the faintest click. A door opened somewhere ahead, and a soft voice crackled through the speakers. "The test begins now." The voice over the speaker sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "What test?" she whispered, but Jake didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for her to stay close. They began to move forward, the sound of their footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. As they approached the center of the room, the red lights flickered, and another sound echoed, a loud metallic scraping that made Sarah flinch. Suddenly, barriers began to move, shifting positions, creating an obstacle course of metal walls. "We have to get through this," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. The walls closed in, leaving them with fewer and fewer options. The path ahead seemed nearly impossible, but Sarah knew they couldn't afford to hesitate. "Stay close," she urged, her heart pounding as they continued to navigate through the maze. As the barriers moved closer, Sarah and Jake had no choice but to sprint. Their footsteps echoed in the confined space, the pressure mounting as the walls continued to close in. "This is insane," Sarah gasped, trying to keep up with Jake's fast pace. He glanced over at her, his eyes filled with both fear and determination. "We have to get to the other side no matter what," he said through gritted teeth. The sound of scraping metal grew louder, and Sarah felt the walls pressing in from both sides. She could feel her pulse racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. They rounded a corner, only to find another set of walls blocking their way. "It's a trap," Sarah whispered, but Jake wasn't listening. He pushed forward, determined. "We're not giving up." With one final burst of energy, Sarah and Jake reached the end of the maze. The metal walls stopped moving, and the sound of scraping ceased. They were breathless, their bodies covered in sweat, but they had made it. The room before them was dimly lit, the air still and silent. A single figure stood at the center watching them. "You survived," the figure said, his voice void of emotion. "But the real test is only beginning." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she and Jake exchanged a glance. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice filled with equal parts defiance and fear. The figure stepped forward, and his cold eyes locked onto hers. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, as the door behind them closed, sealing them in once again.